Father in heaven, Lord, as we open up your word and as we look at the things that are taking place around us, Lord, I just ask for your Spirit to lead us and guide us, Father. And Lord, we ask for your blessing on this seminar, Lord. We ask for your blessing on all the seminars, Father, as people are going to hear your word and your messages, Father. Lord, may our hearts be drawn closer to you. And Lord, may we come away with a closer relationship and a deeper trust and love for you. In Jesus' name, amen. Hold on one second. I have a backup clicker here. All right. So, what is the mark of the beast? Well, we're just going to dive right in. Hopefully you all already have studied this, and so we're just kind of going to give a few statements here. This is, first one, the observance of Sunday is the mark of the beast. Sunday's in quotations because it actually talks about Sunday in the prior sentence, and then talks about the observance of that day as the mark of the beast. So we know from inspiration that the observance of Sunday is the mark of the beast, but it doesn't mean that people are receiving the mark of the beast now if they observe Sunday. And that's the next quote, which says, "Sunday keeping is not yet the mark of the beast, and will not be until the decree goes forth, causing men to worship this idol Sabbath. The time will come when this day will be the test, but that time has not yet come." And so the mark of the beast crisis is when Sunday worship is enforced. And so what we're going to look at today is, could Sunday worship be enforced here in the United States of America? You know, how could that be possible with our current Constitution and its structure? And so I also just want you to turn to 2 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 8. It's talking here about God's final judgment. And it says, "In flaming fire, taking vengeance on those who do not know God," the mark of the beast on the forehead, "and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ." And so here Paul is talking about the mark of the beast is one in where, you know, we know that we can receive it on our hand and on our forehead. And one is not knowing God, and the other is not obeying God. So you might know God, but you don't obey, right? You might know the Sabbath is the right day, but because of convenience, because you want to be able, or you need to be able to buy or sell, you do something different than that which you know is right. And so there will be those who are deceived in thinking Sunday is the right day to worship. And there will also be those who know it's wrong, but out of convenience or fear, persecution, do it anyways. So let's look at the history of the Sunday law and how it came about, because I think that gives us some insight of how the Sunday law will come about in the future. And so Sunday worship came about because of pagan influence. You know, there was the worship of the sun god on Sunday. And it also mixed in with that was anti-Semitism. The Christians did not want to be in the same basket as the Jews. The Jews were being persecuted by Rome, by pagan Rome, and the Christians were being lumped in with them because they also kept and worshipped on the Sabbath. And so they started to compromise. And, you know, we see this fall, when you read about the 7 churches in Revelation, you see the slow progression from the church that was faithful, you know, Ephesus at the beginning, to how it starts to compromise, and then it becomes corrupt, and then, you know, it's a dead church. And so this is why we have to make sure that we don't compromise in our faith. And so it was because of pagan influence and because of anti-Semitism that Christians started to worship on Sunday. And I actually wrote a paper on this in law school. I went abroad and studied in Tel Aviv and studied Christian, Islamic, and Jewish religions and comparative perspectives. And at the end of the class, you had to write this paper, and so I wrote it on the Sabbath and how the different religions worship on different days and how that came about. It was a very interesting research, and I encourage you all to study into that as well. Now, the shift from Sabbath worship to Sunday worship and the laws that were passed really started with Constantine. Constantine was the first government that embraced Christianity. And that is the first time that we saw church and state from a Christian perspective merged together. In fact, in 2025, I thought we were there, we're not there yet. 2025 is the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And the Council of Nicaea was the very first conference where all the Christian churches got together. And at that conference, Constantine set as the emperor, the Pontifex Maximus, the head of the church and the head of the state, and he decided what was the true doctrine of the church. And next year is the 1700th anniversary of that, and the Catholic Church is throwing a big anniversary party. And the World Council of Churches is joining in to commemorate this great event that took place 1,700 years ago, or what they think is great. And so it's very, very interesting. And so Constantine made a law that, mixing Sunday worship with or sun worship with Christian worship, and had his empire, in order to unite the empire, merge the two. And in AD 321, he said, "On the venerable day of the sun, let magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed." And so this was the first legislation of a Christian Sunday law, was by Constantine. It's interesting, if you read about the life of Constantine, it's hard to tell whether he was Christian or not. We're really not sure. And if you read different biographies about him, I don't know. I see a lot of resemblance in Donald Trump, the current incoming president, and working on a sermon, Trump, the modern-day Constantine, just drawing a comparison, because it was really him that united Christianity, and you're seeing Trump uniting Christianity. At least they're uniting around him, and it's very, very interesting. But that's a sermon for another time. I have to look for that one on the American Christian Ministries app. So anyway, it was a slow progression. So first it was, the stop working in the cities, right? The shops need to close down on Sunday in the cities. So if anyone here is not living in the country yet, there's a good reason maybe why we should move to the country, right? If this is the pattern, then we're better off, and we know that from inspiration, we're better off living in the country anyways. In fact, I think there's a quote that those who live in the country and have gardens will be eating like kings and queens, right, during those hard times. Full disclosure, my family and I, we moved out of LA during COVID and now live in Tennessee, which is where my family is, where I was born and raised. And we planted 50 fruit trees this year. Thought we'd do it the Ellen White method, and thought, man, 3-foot hole, that's not that big, right? Well, 3-foot hole is very big, I realize. My daughter, she's like 3 feet tall, and I'm thinking that's pretty short, but it's a big hole you have to dig. So, anyways, digress there. But country living is great, and encourage you all to do that. So we have this progression. So the next, there was the Council of Laodicea in AD 365, where they decreed that Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day. And so here they were specifically the Catholic Church was targeting, it wasn't just honoring Sunday, but now it was you can't worship on the Sabbath. And so then in 83, 86, then they got more strict. It was all civil transactions of every kind on Sunday were strictly forbidden. And so things were shutting down on Sunday. All things were. What's interesting is that this first law came about because the Bishop of Rome went to Constantine and argued to him that it was discrimination. He said it's discrimination to have the public offices, the courts, and the public accommodations open on Sunday because our church members can't use it because they need to be in church, right? And not only that, then they can't serve as judicial officers because they're not available on Sundays. And so you need to shut down because it's discriminatory to Christians to have the government open on Sundays. And so they use this idea of discrimination in order to bring about the Sunday law. And we'll see some Supreme Court decisions that are turning the Constitution on its head and using discrimination in order to get funding for religious institutions. And so everything, all the work had to shut down. People couldn't go to work anymore on Sundays in 386. So what do you think they did? Think they all went to church? Well, we might as well go to church, Can't go to work. Think they did that? No. What'd they do? They all went to the circus. They went to the theaters. Hey, we have off. Let's go to the Coliseum. And so, you can't, the state can't legislate and make someone Christian, right? Either they're Christian or they're not. That's something that's in their heart. That by passing a law is not going to give them the desire to be Christian. And so the church was a little dismayed, and they said, wait a second, our coffers aren't full and our pews are empty. We thought shutting things down would help. And so they went back to the emperor, AD 425, got a law passed that all circuses and theaters must be closed on Sunday. And so now we have all the entertainment shut down on Sunday. Now everyone will come to church, right? Think that's what they did? No, people didn't. Because you can't make people be religious, right? And so people just stayed at home. And I don't know, maybe they gardened. I don't know what they did. And so later on, following that, they said, look, we need to force people to go to church on Sunday. We tried to help them. We tried to encourage them. But when that didn't work, we need to now force them because, we are helping God and we need to help them become Christian, whether they like it or not. And so Augustine wrote this in the 5th century. He says, it is indeed better that men should be brought to serve God by instruction than by fear of punishment or pain. So he says it's better to encourage them by instruction, teaching them, hey, you need to come to church on Sunday, rather than forcing them by punishment or pain. But because the former means are better, the latter must not therefore be neglected. So, we try the first part, but if it doesn't work, it's still okay to force people, right? Many must often be brought back to their Lord like wicked servants by the rod of temporal suffering before they attain the highest grade of religious development. Augustine, in his statement, and then the church requiring Sunday worship started the greatest persecution in history that we know of as the Dark Ages and the Inquisition and all the evil that happened then. And we know in Revelation chapter 13 that this is the same method that will be repeated. It says that in verse 15, he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So first it speaks, just like Augustine says. First we instruct, but when that doesn't work, we cause. We cause everyone to come and worship. And so we see that same idea, that same method played out in the end time. And I believe this is how the Sunday law will happen in America as well. That first it starts with maybe employers having to pay time and a half on Sunday. Anyone heard of that suggestion? Project 2025, right? Where we try to encourage people to take off on Sundays, or maybe we shut down all the shops because of doing so cleans up all the canals in Venice, right? We saw everything shuts down, and so we can reverse climate change. And so we have all these ideas why we should shut down the shops and all, and I think that will happen first in multiple stages. But then what about the NFL, right? People love their Sunday football. Will that be the next step after that? They shut down the shops, everyone's going to go watch football. They're not going to go to church, right? And so then eventually we'll have to move that probably to Saturday, the Sabbath or something like that. And then when that doesn't work, when people still don't go to church, it will come down to requiring Sunday worship. And we see this progression in the Scriptures. Revelation chapter 13. In setting up the image, it's interesting. It says in verse 14, "And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast." So verse 14 says that the government, the United States of America, is telling those who dwell on the earth, who is that? The people, right? It's telling the people, the government's telling the people to make an image to the beast. And then in verse 15, it says, "And he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as who would not worship the image of the beast to be killed." And so we see the first, it's the image to the beast. And then next, it's the image of the beast. There's a difference there. If I make an image to something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's an image of something. For example, when I was in Washington, D.C., there on the Capitol Mall, you can go to the Washington Monument. Anybody been to the Washington Monument, the big obelisk, right? And that is an image to George Washington. At least that's what the plaque says. And so that's not an image of George Washington, right? We don't look at that and say, "Oh, that looks just like George Washington," right? But it's an image to him. It's an honor of him, okay? But then you walk down to the other side of the mall and you see the Lincoln Memorial. And there at the Lincoln Memorial is this giant, 2-3-story high image of Abraham Lincoln sitting in the chair, right? That is an image of Abraham Lincoln. And so there's a difference. An image to doesn't necessarily look like it, but then there's the second stage, which is the image of the beast. And so I think that first stage, I think there's two stages to the Sunday law. At least two overall stages, and there might be smaller ones underneath them. But there's the first one that is the image to the beast, something to honor Rome, right? And maybe it's requiring time and a half by employers for Sunday employees, or shutting down the shops. Maybe that's an image to the beast. That's honoring Rome and their day of worship. But then there is the image of the beast, and that is when the United States of America will force Sunday worship. And at that point in time, church and state have merged together because the state is enforcing the worship and the religious dogmas of the church. And so that would be an image of the beast. That would be the United States looking like Rome, looking like the papacy. And so we see two stages here in Scripture, and there might be other smaller stages that follow under each one of those categories. And Ellen White talks about this as well. She says the time will come when men will not only forbid Sunday work. In other words, she's saying that there was a time before this that Sunday work will be forbidden. So that's one stage, right? But she says not only that, but they will also try to force men to labor on the Sabbath. So they will require you to violate your day of worship, and men will be asked to renounce the Sabbath and to subscribe to Sunday observance, or forfeit their freedom and their lives. And so you see the first phase, legislation to forbid Sunday work, and then the second phase, legislation to force Sunday observance and to renounce Sabbath observance. And so there's these two stages, and this is how America speaks like a dragon. Ellen White says that when a nation speaks through its legislation and through its judicial enactments or its courts. And so when it is passed by law, by Congress, and the courts uphold it, that is the nation speaking. And when this nation speaks like a dragon, it's when it passes these Sunday laws and enforces Sunday worship. So how is this possible? How is this possible here in the United States of America? Maybe 6-7 years ago, we wouldn't think that would be possible, right? And there were many naysayers out there because we have our great Constitution. This is the greatest civil document ever written in history. And we have the First Amendment to it, the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, notice it does not say Congress shall make no law establishing a church. There was that suggestion at the Constitutional Convention, but that was shot down. They wanted it to be broader than that. And so they said Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And so this deals with all forms of worship and promoting or inhibiting religion by the government. Then the Free Exercise Clause follows that, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And so this prohibits the government from passing laws that keeps you from practicing your sincerely held religious beliefs. And so it seems like for America to stop work on Sundays, that would be a violation of the Establishment Clause, right? Because that would be them helping a religion, endorsing Sunday worship. And so how can they do that with the Establishment Clause in place? And then how can they keep Seventh-day Adventists from worshiping on the Sabbath when we have the Free Exercise Clause, right? It seems like that's a big problem that's in their way. By the decree enforcing the institution of the papacy, in violation of the law of God, our nation will disconnect herself fully from righteousness. Our country shall repudiate every principle of its Constitution as a Protestant and Republican government, and shall make provision for the propagation of papal falsehoods and delusions. Then we may know that the time has come for the marvelous working of Satan, and that the end is near. And so Ellen White tells us that our country will repudiate those constitutional principles. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that the Constitution will be changed? It's very difficult for the Constitution to be amended. Do you know what it takes to amend the Constitution? We need a 2/3 vote from both houses of Congress. So the Senate and the House has to vote to change it. And then you need 3/4 of all the states to ratify it. And so in our polarized environment, that seems almost impossible, right? It seems like a big hurdle to have to overcome. Now, it's interesting that it takes both the government and the people, right? Congress has to pass it, but then the people have to vote on it. And I don't know if there's any relation to that and the Bible here where it says that he told those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast. In other words, the government is telling the people that, hey, you need to change the law in order to bring about this image of the beast. And so, when I read that verse, I don't know, maybe it's my religious liberty bias or perspective, but it seems like it's maybe alluding to a constitutional change, a change to our Constitution, because it's the people that rule here in America. That's how our government is set up, for the people, by the people, of the people. And so in order to have our Constitution changed, it's the people that have to agree to change it. It can't just be the government. It can't just be Congress or the state. And so that's one way to bring about the Sunday law, is by changing the Constitution. And I think that will have to happen in order to force Sunday worship. But what about the first stage of the Sunday law? What about just requiring people to take off on Sundays because we want people to rest on Sunday because it's better for the environment, or because we want to encourage families to spend time with one another? What about those first stages of the Sunday law? Would those be constitutional? And in order to make those constitutional, we don't have to change the Constitution. What we can do is just reinterpret the law. And so instead of saying this law is religious, we'll just say it's secular, right? And then it doesn't violate the First Amendment. That's convenient, right? And so our Supreme Court can say, well, it could be viewed religious, but we could also view it as secular. It's helping the environment, or it's helping families, or it's giving workers a day off, and so it's helping mental health, or whatever excuse they want to come up with. And so if we just reinterpret things that are religious and make them secular, then it skirts around the Constitution. Well, have we seen the court do that in any cases? Let's look at a few Supreme Court cases. This is a case from June 2005. The Van Orden versus Perry case. And there in Texas, at the state capitol, was installed a 6-foot monument of the Ten Commandments. And Mr. Van Orden had to drive that route to work every day, and it bothered him that the Ten Commandments were there on the government property. And he wondered, how is that possible with our Constitution? And so he decided that he would file a lawsuit to remove this display from public property, where it seemed as though the state of Texas was endorsing one religious belief over another, and so it violated the Establishment Clause. And so this case worked its way up to the Supreme Court, and the court explained that, it's the Ten Commandments, but it serves a secular purpose. And so, it might appear to be religious, but, we believe that it doesn't appear to a reasonable observer to represent a government endorsement of religion. They said, the motivation was for societal concerns. They put the Ten Commandments up because of a decline in morality. This is what the court is saying. And so it wasn't motivated by a back to church initiative. And so it wasn't, the state wasn't wanting people to go back to church. They were just wanting them to be more moral. And that's a good thing, right? And so that's a secular purpose. Now, I question whether morality is a secular purpose, but you'll have to listen to my talk from yesterday to learn more about that. This was him taking something that is obviously religious. Anyone ever seen the Ten Commandments and thought, oh, that's a secular piece of rock, right? No. And so they took something that's clearly religious and they secularized it in order to skirt around the First Amendment issues. We saw this again in 2019, the Bladensburg Cross case. Anybody live in Bladensburg, Maryland? Okay, you drive by the cross? All right. So this is a 40-foot tall cross that was erected on government property to honor those who died in World War I. And the government, there was a lawsuit that went up trying to remove the cross from the public property, from the public grounds. And the ones that were defending the cross argued to the Supreme Court that, the cross is really a secular symbol. Now, this is a group of Christians that wanted to keep the cross there, and they're arguing to the court, in order to keep the cross there, they're arguing that the cross is a secular symbol. And, I find it a little disingenuous and a little alarming if we have to argue that our religious symbols are secular in order to get them in the public display. Maybe we're doing something wrong. But the Supreme Court bit. They said, the cross is, it might have originated as a Christian symbol, but it's taken on a secular meaning. In particular, the cross has become a symbol of memorializing those who died during World War I. Now, I've seen a lot of crosses in my life. I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever thought about World War I looking at a cross. But hey, maybe other people have. Maybe I'm the outlier there. But so you can see how the court skirts around the religious liberty problem by secularizing religion. I think Ellen White has a quote on that. Where is it? The union of the church and the state be the degree never so slight, while it may appear to bring the world nearer to the church, does in reality but bring the church nearer to the world. And so we think, man, if we can just get our symbol out there, then people will see it and they'll give their hearts to Jesus, or they'll start obeying the Ten Commandments, right? And so we think it's this good thing. Let's unite with the state to get Christianity out there. And we think that this will be great for Christianity, but the pen of inspiration says that while we think it will bring the world closer to the church, what in reality it does, it brings the church closer to the world. And so this is why we must maintain the separation of church and state. And so the Bladensburg Cross is still there in Maryland. We have another case. This one hits a little closer to home for Seventh-day Adventists. This one goes back to 1961. It kind of set the precedent for secularizing religion in order to skirt around the First Amendment issues. This case is McGowan versus Maryland. Interesting, these cases are arising out of Maryland. I don't know if there's anything to that, but so Maryland passed a law, and the law is actually titled in Maryland's legislative books, titled Sabbath breaking. Now, does that sound like a religious law, or does that sound like a civil, secular law? Religious law, right? And it forbids work or bodily labor on the Lord's day. It says that right there in the legislation. But it didn't stop there. It also forbids people from profaning the Lord's day by gaming and fishing and doing a whole host of other things. And it refers to Sunday as the Sabbath day. This law allowed stores to only sell certain items on Sunday. So you could sell essential things like milk, bread, gasoline, newspapers, and tobacco, essential things. But it was a penalty, and not just a civil penalty, it was a criminal penalty if somebody wanted something other than that, like maybe a 3-ring loose-leaf binder, a stapler, and some staples. And that's what Mr. McGowan went into the store to buy. And they, not McGowan, I think that was the store owner. But this man went in to buy a stapler, a 3-ring loose-leaf binder, some staples on Sunday, and the store was criminally indicted for selling staples on Sunday because they weren't essential items under this Sunday closing Sabbath-breaking statute. And so they filed a lawsuit saying this violates my First Amendment rights, and it went up to the United States Supreme Court there in 1961, and the Supreme Court issued a ruling saying that there were secular grounds for finding, for why the government can take action closing things down on Sundays. Now, it would have been a lot easier, for the Supreme Court to have found that if the law wasn't just so overtly religious, right? If it was labeled maybe, family time on the weekend or something. But it's labeled Sabbath breaking and banning labor on the Lord's day, right? And the Supreme Court completely ignores all that language in its decision. And it said Sunday closing laws are based on secular rather than religious state interests. So even though the state only cited all these religious reasons and even gave it a religious name for a statute, the Supreme Court just turns a blind eye and says that Sunday closing laws are secular rather than religious. The laws are to improve the health, safety, recreation, and general well-being of citizens. The present purpose of the law is to provide a uniform day of rest for all. The fact that this day is of particular significance for various Christian sects does not bar the state from achieving its secular goals. And so the court here, the United States Supreme Court, has already ruled that Sunday laws, at least that first stage, is constitutional. They just ignore the Constitution and say it doesn't deal with, it's not a constitutional issue, right, is what they are saying. And so that person suffered criminal penalties because they sold a stapler on Sunday. Now, it was very interesting because 2 weeks before the Supreme Court issued its ruling, Pope John the 23rd issued an encyclical. And he said the Catholic Church has decreed for many centuries that Christians observe this day of rest on Sunday. We exhort all men, whether public officials or representatives of management and labor, that they observe this command of God Himself and of the Catholic Church, and judge in their souls that they have a responsibility to God and society in this regard. And so the Pope is kind of giving his thoughts, I feel like, on what the court should do in that case. And I don't know, maybe it's just coincidence, maybe not. And so we see this, merging of church and state. Well, back in 2022, a little more recently, the Supreme Court actually cited that prior case, that McGowan versus Maryland, saying that is still good law. And this is our current Supreme Court justices, the current makeup on the court. This was the Kennedy versus Bremerton case. Anybody hear about the coach praying on the football field, the high school coach? Yeah, so this case kind of got overshadowed by the overturning of Roe versus Wade that same summer. But I think this case is actually the more important case and the one that has more far-reaching implications. Because what the court did was that they changed the Establishment Clause test. And so before, in order for a law to not violate the Establishment Clause, it had to pass this test called the Lemon Test, where it had to be a secular purpose, it had to have a primary effect that does not advance a religion or inhibit a religion, and it can't foster the entanglement of government and religion. And so it was a very rigorous test that made it hard for governments to pass laws that impacted religion. And so the court threw that out, and they said, for Establishment Clause violations, we're just going to now look at the history and tradition of our nation. And if we allowed it in the past, we'll say it doesn't violate the Establishment Clause. But if we didn't allow it, then it does violate the Establishment Clause. And so this is a very subjective test, right? It's up to the whim of 5 Supreme Court justices to decide what they think our history and tradition is. And so I think, this new test will have far-reaching implications. In fact, we're already seeing this in our in religious circles where they feel like it's open season now at the Supreme Court, right? And particularly for Christianity, because we have a history and tradition of allowing Christian things in our nation, but not allowing things of other religions. For example, Bible reading in schools, right? We have a history and tradition of having Bible reading in our schools. But what about reading the Quran? There's no history and tradition of that, so it seems like, well, that doesn't come under, that would be an Establishment Clause violation because that's not a tradition in America. But reading the Bible is, so we'll allow that, right? And so you can see how the government can easily favor one religion, Christianity, and it's not a constitutional violation because it was allowed in the past. And so the state of Oklahoma said, you know what? We're going to require all schools, all schools grades 5 to 12 must now incorporate the Bible in all their lesson plans. And so, this just happened this summer that was passed. What do you think? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? A bad thing? It's a good thing for people to be reading the Bible, right? But do we want our state teaching the Bible? Whose Bible is it, right? What version and what interpretation are they giving? And so I think there's problems with doing that. But, I also think we need to tread lightly on this topic. In fact, this is a letter that Ellen White wrote to A.T. Jones back in 1890s. They were trying to push for Bible reading in all the public schools. Because remember, the First Amendment didn't apply to the states until after the Civil War. And so the states could allow Bible reading, so that was part of the history and tradition. But then after the Civil War and the 14th Amendment passed, the Constitution then applied to the states as well. And so they were trying to bring Bible reading in and requiring it in all the schools there. And A.T. Jones was adamantly opposed to that. And Ellen White tells him, hey, you need to tread lightly. She says, "While I do not see the justice nor right in enforcing by law the bringing of the Bible to be read in the public schools, yet there are some things which burden my mind in regard to our people, making prominent their ideas on this point. These things, I am sure, will place us in the wrong light before the world. Cautions were given me on this point." And so she says to be cautious, when dealing with this issue. We also saw where Louisiana has now decided that they are going to require all schools to display the Ten Commandments. And in the display underneath it, the schools have to put, this is in line with the history and tradition of our nation. So they're using the Supreme Court's little quote there because they know it's going to be challenged and trying to tee it up to the Supreme Court. Hey, we're just doing history and tradition here, right? And so you can see them using this new Supreme Court test to push Christianity in the public sphere. Ellen White says, when the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such points of doctrine, are held by them in common, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and sustain their institutions, then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. And so when the church goes to the state to get its ideas and its dogmas put in the public sphere, using the state to enforce that, and when they try to get funds from the state to support their institutions, then she says, know that they have formed the image of the Roman hierarchy. And what's interesting is that we saw the state of Oklahoma approve the first public Christian or religious school. It is the Roman Catholic school, the St. Isidore of Sevilla Catholic Virtual School. And so this is going to be this is a public Catholic school. Now, obviously, that is a huge oxymoron, but this was actually approved by the state of Oklahoma, at least their Department of Education. And so it will be the nation's first religious school entirely funded by taxpayers. And so the residents of Oklahoma will be funding this. This school will be teaching Catholic theology, and will be just a regular Catholic school that is being fully funded by the state government. Now, obviously, this caused a lawsuit to come about challenging it. It went up to the Oklahoma Supreme Court, and this summer the Oklahoma Supreme Court struck it down. And so they appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and that goes before the Supreme Court on January 10 in a few weeks to decide whether they will take this case to overturn the state Supreme Court of Oklahoma, which said, hey, the Oklahoma State Supreme Court said you can't do this. It is a violation of the Constitution. And so the United States Supreme Court will decide on January 10 whether or not they will take this case. So you might want to keep that in prayer. It says the state and church are entwined as has never happened before. This was an article talking about it. It's interesting. I met the attorney that is handling this case, representing the school, before the Supreme Court at a religious liberty meeting in L.A. earlier this year. And come to find out, he is the previous clerk to Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito and he also clerked for Neil Gorsuch before that when he was on the circuit court. So the person representing the school is very well connected, and he said, oh, we're going to win. We're going to win. And I said, I hope you don't. I hope you don't. But, I'm afraid that he's probably right. Because what they're arguing is that it's discriminatory for them to allow other private charter schools that aren't connected to religion, and so they're discriminating against religion by not allowing it. So they're using discrimination in order to try to undermine the separation of church and state. So I think I am out of time. Or wait, I have 4 more minutes. Wonderful. Okay. The reason why he said that he thinks they will win is because we've had these set of cases by the Supreme Court that has turned the understanding of the First Amendment kind of on its head. And that started in June of 2017. It's the case Trinity Lutheran versus Comer. And in that case, a church wanted money from the state to resurface its playground. They were offering schools grants to resurface their playgrounds, and a church applied and said, hey, I should get, we need our playground resurfaced. And so they applied, and the state said, no, we can't, use public funds, taxpayer dollars to fund religion. And so that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, hey, this, it's a playground, right? It's not a big deal. And it's not the church is religious, but, a playground's not religious, right? And so they said you're discriminating against that playground because it's connected to a religion. And so they used discrimination to to allow it. And Sotomayor wrote a dissent that I think has a lot of good information for us. I normally don't agree with her, but in this case, I find myself agreeing with her. She says, the court today profoundly changes that relationship between church and state by holding for the first time in our nation's history, the court has held that the Constitution requires the government to provide public funds directly to a church. So up until 2017, at no time did the Constitution ever require public funds to support a church. And what did Ellen White say? That when the church goes to the state to receive funds to sustain its institutions, know that it is setting up the image of the beast. And so we see that the church going to the state and the Supreme Court holding for the first time that the Constitution requires government to fund the church. And then again, a similar case, Espinoza versus Montana here. This was a school voucher case. And the state of Montana would not give vouchers to religious schools. And the government said, no, that's discrimination. You're just discriminating against them because they're religious. And then the similar situation happened in 2022, the Carson versus Macon. In that case, Maine refused to give vouchers to schools that teach religion. And that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you're discriminating. They cited their prior precedent, the Trinity Lutheran, the Espinoza case. And the dissent said, we have never previously held what the court holds today, namely that a state must use state funds to pay for religious education. And so what's interesting is Maine, after this case came out, guess what Maine did? Maine said, fine, you're going to make us give taxpayer dollars to religious education? All you religious schools that want our money, you cannot discriminate based on LGBT. And so they attach strings to those funds. So now if religious schools want to take those funds, they have to accept the state's ideology on LGBT issues. And that's actually being litigated now. And so it'll be very interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with that case. So what's the end goal? What's the end goal in all this? Well, Ellen White tells us in The Great Controversy, in the movements now in progress in the United States to secure for the institutions of the church the support of the state, So those movements where they're going to the state to get support to sustain their institutions, she says Protestants are following in the steps of the papists. Nay, more, they are opening the door for the papacy to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which she has lost in the old world. And that which gives greater significance to this movement is the fact that the principal object contemplated is the enforcement of Sunday observance. So this idea of getting money from the state to sustain our religious Christian institutions is the end goal is enforcement of Sunday observance. And so it is something that we need to be aware of. And as we see these things changing and taking place, it's important for us to recognize the truth of God's Word and to draw closer to Him. And so with that, I thank you all for coming. I hope you stick around for the next session, and thank you.